नमस्कार। मैं आनंद कुमार खत्री, एसोसिएट प्रोफेसर ऑफ जूलॉजी, गवर्नमेंट डूंगर कॉलेज बीकानेर। आज के हमारे लेक्चर का विषय है एटमॉस्फियर पार्ट सेकंड, वाटर बजट। The water budget at the air surface interface is also of crucial importance in influencing atmospheric processes. The surface gain water through precipitation, rain and snow, direct condensation and deposition, dew and frost on land. The precipitation is often so large that some of it infiltrate into the ground or runs off into streams, river, lakes, and the ocean. Some of the precipitations remaining on the surface, such as in puddles or on vegetation, immediately evaporates back into the atmosphere. This is the hydrologic cycle. In the hydrologic cycle, water is transferred between the land surface, ocean, and the atmosphere. Liquid water in the soil is also converted to water vapor by transpiration from the leaves and stems of plants by evaporation. The roots of vegetation may extract water from within the soil and emit it through stoma or small opening on the leaves. In addition, water may be evaporated from the surface of the soil directly when groundwater from below is diffused upward. Evaporation occurs at the surface of water bodies at a rate that is inversely proportional to the relative humidity immediately above the surface. Evaporation is rapid in dry air but much slower when the lowest level of the atmosphere are close to saturation. Evaporation from soils is dependent on the rate at which moisture is supplied by capillary suction within the soil, whereas transpiration from vegetation is dependent on both the water available within the root zone of plants and whether the stoma are open on leaf surface. Water that evaporates and transfers into the atmosphere is often transported long distance before it precipitates out. The input, transports, and removal of water from the atmosphere is part of the hydrologic cycle. At any one time, only a very small fraction of Earth's water is present within the atmosphere. If all the atmospheric water was condensed out, it would cover the surface of the planet only to an average of about 2.5 centimeter 1 inch. Nitrogen budget. The nitrogen budget involves the chemical transformation of diatomic nitrogen N2, which makes up 78% of the atmospheric gases, into compounds containing ammonium, nitrite, and nitrates. In a process called nitrification or nitrogen fixation, bacteria such as rhizobium living within nodules on the roots of peas, clovers, and other legumes convert diatomic nitrogen gas to ammonia. A small amount of nitrogen is also fixed by lightning. Ammonia may be further transformed by other bacteria into nitrites and nitrates and used by the plant growth. These compounds are eventually converted back to nitrogen after the plants die or are eaten by denitrifying bacteria. These bacteria, in their consumption of plants and both the excrement and corpses of plant eating animals, convert much of the nitrogen compounds back to nitrogen. Some of these compounds are also converted to nitrogen by a series of chemical processes associated with ultraviolet light from the sun. The combustion of petroleum by motor vehicles also produce says oxides of nitrogen which enhance the natural concentrations of these compounds. Smog, which occurs in many urban areas, is associated with substantially higher levels of nitrogen oxides. This is the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle transforms diatomic nitrogen gas into ammonium nitrates and nitrite compounds. Sulfur budget. The sulfur budget is also of major importance. Sulfur is put into the atmosphere as a result of weathering of sulfur containing rocks and intermittent volcanic emissions. Organic forms of sulfur are incorporated into living organisms and present an important component in both the structure and the function of proteins. Sulfur also appears in the atmosphere as the gas sulfur dioxide SO2 and as part of particulate compounds containing sulfate SO4. Alone, both are directly dry deposited or precipitated out onto Earth's surface. When wetted, these compounds are converted to causatic sulfuric acid H2SO4. This is the Mount St. Helens volcano, which viewed from the south during its eruption on May 18, 1980. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, human activities have injected significant quantities of sulfur into the atmosphere through the combustion of fossil fuels. In and near regions of urbanization and heavy industrial activities, the enhanced deposition and precipitation of sulfur in the form of sulfuric acid and of nitrogen oxides in the form of nitric acid HNO3, resulting from vehicular emissions, have been associated with damage of fish population, forest statues, and building exteriors. The conversion of sulfur and nitrogen oxide to acid such as H2SO4 and HNO3 is commonly known as the acid rain problem. Sulfur and nitrogen oxides are precipitated in rain, snow, and dry deposition to the surface during dry weather. Carbon budget. The carbon budget in the atmosphere is of critical importance to climate and to life. Carbon appears in Earth's atmosphere primarily as carbon dioxide CO2 produced naturally by the respiration of living organisms, the decay of these organisms, the weathering of carbon containing rock, strata, and volcanic emissions. Plants utilize CO2, water, and solar insolation to convert CO2 to diatomic oxygen O2. This process, known as photosynthesis, can result in local reduction of CO2 to of tons of parts per million within vegetation canopies. In contrast, nighttime respiration occurring when photosynthesis is not active can increase CO2 concentration. These concentrations may even double within dense tropical forest canopies for short period before sunrise. On the global scale, seasonal variations of about 1% occur as a result of CO2 uptake from photosynthesis, plant respiration, and soil respiration. Atmospheric CO2 is primarily absorbed in the northern hemisphere during the growing season, spring to autumn. CO2 is also absorbed by ocean water. The rate of exchange to the ocean is greater for colder than for warmer waters. Currently, CO2 makes up about 0.03% of the gaseous composition of the atmosphere. This is the carbon cycle, showing the mixing of other gases H2O and O2. Carbon cycle is transported in various forms through the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the geologic formation. One of the primary pathways for the exchange of the carbon dioxide CO2 take place between the atmosphere and the ocean. There is a fraction of CO2 combines with water forming carbonic acid H2CO3 that subsequently loses hydrogen ion H plus to form bicarbonate HCO3 minus and carbonates CO2 CO3 2 minus ions. Mollusk cells or minerals precipitates that forms by the reaction of calcium or other metal ions with carbonate. Many may become buried in geologic strata and eventually release CO2 through volcanic outgassing. Carbon dioxide also exchanges through photosynthesis in plants and through respiration in an animal dead and decaying organic matter may ferment and release CO2 or methane CH4 or may be incorporated into sedimentary rocks where it is converted to fossil fuels. Burning of hydrocarbon fuels return CO2 and H2O to the atmosphere. The biological and anthropogenic pathway are much faster than the geochemical pathways and consequently have a greater impact on the composition and temperature of the atmosphere. In the geologic past, CO2 levels have been significantly higher than they are today and have had a significant effect on both climate and ecology during the Carboniferous period 360 to 300 million years ago. For example, moderately warm and humid climates combined with high concentrations of CO2 were associated with extensive lush vegetations. After these plants die and decomposed, they were converted to sedimentary rocks that eventually become the coal deposits currently used for the industrial combustion. Living organism influences the cycling of carbon and oxygen through the environment. In the atmosphere, certain wavelengths of long wave radiations are absorbed and then re-emitted by CO2. Since the lower level of the atmosphere are warmer than layer higher up, the absorption of upward propagating electromagnetic radiation and a re-emission of a portion of it back downward permits the lower atmosphere to remain warmer than it would be otherwise. The associations of higher concentrations of CO2 in the air with a warmer lower troposphere is commonly referred to the greenhouse effect. The name is inaccurate. An actual greenhouse is warmed primarily because solar radiation enters through the glass which retains the heat air and prevents the mixing of cooler air into the greenhouse from above. Earth's atmosphere is segmented into two major zones. The homosphere is the lower of the two and the location in which turbulent mixing dominates the molecular diffusion of gases. In this region, which occurs below 100 km, about 660 miles or so, the composition of the atmosphere tends to be independent of height. Above 100 km in the zone called the heterosphere, the various atmospheric gases are separated by molecular mass, with the lighter gases being concentrated in the highest layer above 1000 km, about 600 miles. Helium and hydrogen are the dominant species. Diatomic nitrogen N2, a relatively heavy gas, drop off rapidly with the height and exists in only trace amount at 500 km and above. This decrease in the concentration of heavier gases with height is largest during period of low sun activity when temperature within the heterosphere are relatively low. The transition zone located at a height of around 100 km between the homosphere and heterosphere is called the turbopause. This is the atmospheric vertical structure, the layers of Earth's atmosphere showing the heights of the characteristic atmospheric phenomena. The atmosphere can be further divided into several distinct layers defined by changes in air temperature with increasing height. These layers are described in below in order of increasing height above the surface. Thanks.